They called me invisible, a faded shadow unworthy of a seat at a lavish wedding. But when I walked into that chapel, excluded from the life I built for my son, nobody knew my silence was ash hiding a fire. That flame was about to burn down everyone who mistook my age for weakness. When a mother is betrayed at the end of her life, she does not seek revenge like a child. She strikes like a hurricane. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 54 years old, and for the better part of 3 decades, I have made myself small so that my son could feel big. I live in a quiet 2-bedroom house on the edge of town, the kind of place where you count every kilowatt of electricity and wash Ziploc bags to use them a second time. That is a habit I picked up during my 20 years as a floor manager at Atwell Community Services. When you spend your life managing crisis resources for the desperate, you learn that waste is a sin. I thought I had taught my son, Jared, that same lesson. I was wrong. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It was made of cream-colored cardstock, so thick and heavy it felt like a slab of marble in my hands. The calligraphy on the front was embossed in gold leaf. Inside, the announcement was breathtaking. It declared that Jared Hale and Sienna Rowell were to be joined in holy matrimony at a resort in Ridgeford Bay. I felt a surge of warmth in my chest, the instinctive pride of a mother seeing her child reach a milestone. But then I turned the card over. I looked for the RSVP card. I looked for the note about the rehearsal dinner. I looked for the words, mother of the groom. There was nothing. I went to the wedding website listed at the bottom of the card, my fingers trembling as I typed the address into my old laptop. I entered my last name into the guest verification tool. Access denied. I tried again. Access denied. I sat there in the silence of my kitchen, the refrigerator humming loudly against the quiet. This was not a mistake. This was a message. I had not been invited to my own son's wedding. I had simply been sent a notification, the same way a company notifies a shareholder of a merger. My chest tightened, a physical ache that radiated down my left arm. I looked around my living room. Every piece of furniture here was bought second-hand so that Jared could have new cleats, new textbooks, and a new laptop when he started college. I remembered the nights I sat at this very table, eating plain oatmeal for dinner, so there would be enough money to pay for his field trips. I remembered the day I walked into the bank 20 years ago. I signed my name on a loan for $50,000 to help him start his first business venture. I put my own financial future on the line, risking the little security I had, because I believed in him. I never told him how hard it was to pay that back. I never told anyone. Now, Jared is the self-made man. That is what the local business journals call him. And Sienna comes from a world where people do not look at price tags. She looks at me with a polite, thin smile that never reaches her eyes. To her, and now apparently to my son, I am just a remnant of a past they want to scrub away. I am the woman in the outdated polyester coat. I am the reminder of the poverty Jared escaped. They view me as a burden, a relic that does not fit into the glossy, high society narrative they are constructing. I stared at the gold lettering on the invitation until my vision blurred. Is this just thoughtlessness? Is Jared simply so wrapped up in Sienna's world that he forgot the woman who carried him? A man does not forget his mother by accident. This feels deliberate. It feels like an amputation. I stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the world was moving on, indifferent to the woman standing in the shadows. But something cold and hard was settling in my stomach, replacing the grief. If they think I will sit here and weep into a handkerchief while they toast to their future, they are mistaken. I am not just a line item to be deleted. I am his mother. I need to know why. I need to know if this is just Sienna's influence, or if my son truly looked at the guest list and decided I was not worth the cost of a plate. I will not call him and beg. I will not give them the satisfaction of hearing my voice crack. I am going to find out the truth. And then I am going to make sure they realize exactly who they have decided to leave behind. There was a time when Sunday nights were sacred. No matter how busy Jared was with his studies or his early business ventures, he would call me at 7 o'clock sharp. We would talk for an hour, sometimes two, about everything from the price of gas to the dreams he had of building an empire. I was his confidant, his anchor. But as his bank account grew, the duration of those calls shrank. The warmth in his voice was replaced by a clipped, professional tone, the kind one uses with a subordinate who is taking up too much time. The shift began about 5 years ago. Jared had just landed his first major contract, a deal worth $200,000. I wanted to celebrate with a home-cooked meal, but he insisted on taking me to a steakhouse downtown. I wore my best dress, a floral print I had bought at a department store sale for $30. I thought I looked nice. But when we walked in, I saw Jared's eyes darting around the room, checking to see if anyone important was watching. He spent the entire meal apologizing to the waiter for things that did not need apologizing for, acting as if my very presence was a breach of etiquette. That was the night he stopped introducing me as his mother and started introducing me as Margaret. Then came Sienna. She did not scream or shout. Her cruelty was far more sophisticated. She was the one who whispered in his ear that a man of his stature could not be associated with someone who managed food pantries and organized clothing drives. I overheard her once at a Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. She was in the kitchen with Jared, her voice low and smooth. She told him that family is a reflection of the brand, and frankly, I was dragging his stock value down. She made him feel that his background was a stain he needed to bleach out. To Sienna and her family, I was the poor relation who lacked the grace to disappear. They treated me like a piece of furniture that clashed with their modern decor, something to be tolerated until it could be moved to the basement. It was not just Sienna. I later learned that his circle of friends, young men who had never worked a day of manual labor in their lives, had advised him to keep me at arm's length. They told him that having a mother who looked like she clipped coupons would undercut his narrative of being a sophisticated visionary. They told him to leave me at home to save face. And he listened. The calls stopped coming on Sundays. When we did speak, it was brief. He would say he was in a meeting or catching a flight. I tried to hold on. I sent text messages asking about his day. I mailed him articles I thought he would like. I was fighting for a place in my son's life, grasping at smoke as he drifted further and further away. I felt the separation not just in distance, but in the fundamental way he viewed me. I was no longer the woman who raised him. I was a liability. The final blow came 3 days ago. I ran into Linda, a woman I used to work with at Atwell Community Services. She had taken a part-time catering gig to make ends meet, and she had worked a pre-wedding cocktail party for Jared's investors. She looked at me with pity in her eyes, a look I despise. She told me she had heard Jared talking to a group of shareholders when asked if his mother was excited about the wedding. Jared had laughed and said that his mother would not be coming because travel was too difficult for her at her age. He had lied. He had erased me to make himself comfortable. The betrayal hit me harder than any physical blow. It felt like a cold blade twisting between my ribs. All those years of double shifts, of wearing shoes with holes in the soles so he could have tutors, of silencing my own needs so his voice could be heard, it all amounted to this. He was ashamed of me. I sat in my kitchen, the silence ringing in my ears. I could have cried. I could have called him and screamed. But tears are for the helpless, and I was done being helpless. If Jared and Sienna thought they could edit me out of their perfect life like a typo, they were wrong. I would not stay home. I would not play the part of the frail, old woman. I was going to that wedding. I was going to walk into that resort in Ridgeford Bay, not to beg for a seat at the table, but to remind them exactly whose shoulders they were standing on. My grief had burned away, leaving only a cold, hard resolve. I started to plan. I went into the dusty archives of my own life that evening. I pulled down the heavy metal box from the top shelf of the hallway closet, the one where I kept every tax return, every receipt, and every legal document from the last 30 years. I needed to trace the lines of money because money leaves a trail that lies cannot cover. I sat on the floor, surrounded by yellowing paper, and it did not take me long to find exactly what I was looking for. It was a document dated October 4th, 2014. It was the original loan agreement for Jared's first startup. I ran my finger over the signature line. There it was. My name. Margaret Hale, signed in blue ink right next to his. I had co-signed a loan for $50,000 because the bank would not touch a 24-year-old with no assets. But as I cross-referenced this with the credit report I had pulled up on my laptop, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The loan had not been paid off. It had been refinanced, rolled over, and expanded. But my name was still attached to the root of the collateral. Legally, I was still the safety net for his empire. I pieced together the narrative through printed interviews and online articles I had bookmarked. In a feature for a business magazine published just last month, Jared claimed he had built his company from the ground up with nothing but his own savings and grit. He called himself a self-made man. He had erased me. And then I understood why. It was not just Jared. It was Sienna and her family. They could not tolerate the narrative that their wealthy, successful son-in-law was propped up by a mother who bought her clothes at thrift stores. To admit he needed me was to admit he was not one of them. The confirmation came from a place I should have checked sooner. Jared had left an old tablet at my house 2 Christmases ago, and he had never logged out of his email account. I powered it on, praying the password had not changed. It had not. I scrolled past the business emails until I found a thread with the subject line, "The guest list issue." It was forwarded from one of Sienna's bridesmaids. The message was short and brutal. It read, "We have to make sure the mother is handled. She is a shameful card to play at a wedding like this. If she shows up looking like a charity case, the optics will be a disaster." They were not just indifferent to my presence. They were actively strategizing against it. They discussed security measures. They discussed how to divert me if I tried to call. And then I saw the final update. Sienna had changed the venue. The announcement I had seen online for the resort was a decoy, or perhaps an old plan they had scrapped to ensure privacy. They were moving the ceremony to a private estate called the Gilded Cage, a venue that was not listed on the public registry. They thought they were clever. They thought that by changing the location and keeping me in the dark, they could ensure their perfect day remained spotless. But they forgot that I spent 20 years working with people in the service industry. I know the caterers, the florists, and the event planners in this state. I made 3 phone calls. The third one was to a woman named Clara, whose son I had helped get into a rehab program 5 years ago. Clara was now working for the luxury florist, handling the Hale Rowell wedding. She hesitated when I asked her, but she owed me. She gave me the address. She told me the ceremony started at 5 in the afternoon and that security would be tight. She sounded worried for me. She told me I should probably just stay home and not cause a scene. I thanked her and hung up. I looked at the loan documents still sitting on my lap. I looked at the tablet glowing with their hateful words. They wanted to bury me. They wanted to pretend that the foundation of their wealth did not come from my sweat and my risk. They thought they had checkmated me by hiding the location. I stood up and walked to my closet. I pushed aside the old coats and reached for the garment bag in the back. Inside was a suit I had not worn in years, charcoal grey, sharp, and commanding. It was the suit I wore when I had to fight for funding for the community centre. It was armour. I was going to Ridgeford Bay. I was going to walk into that wedding, and I was not going to sit in the back. They had spent months planning a fairy tale, but they had forgotten to account for the dragon they had created. I was coming, and not a single one of them was ready for what I was bringing with me. I sat alone in the dim light of my living room, the air heavy with the scent of old paper and dust. On my lap lay a scrapbook I had not opened in 3 years. It was filled with fragments of a life that now felt like a hallucination. There was a photo of Jared at 7 years old, missing his front tooth, holding a plastic trophy from a spelling bee. I remembered that day. I had walked 3 miles to get to his school because I did not have the gas money to drive, just so I could see him stand on that stage. I remembered the nights I sat in the dark to save electricity, eating toast for dinner so he could have meat and vegetables. I had carved pieces out of my own existence to build a foundation for his. And now, he had stepped onto that foundation and kicked the ladder away. For a long moment, I considered staying right there in that chair. Why go? Why force myself into a room where I am looked at like a stain on a silk tablecloth? It would be easier to let them have their victory. It would be easier to swallow the humiliation, turn off the lights, and disappear into the obscurity they had designed for me. I almost convinced myself that staying away was the noble thing to do, the final sacrifice of a mother who loves her son enough to let him erase her. But then the phone rang. It was Arthur, an old friend who still worked as a paralegal at the firm handling Jared's business mergers. His voice was hushed, vibrating with the anxiety of someone who knows they are breaking privilege. He told me he had seen the draft of the prenuptial agreement Sienna's family was forcing Jared to sign. It was not a marriage contract. It was a subjugation. The Rowells were leveraging Jared's past against him. Arthur told me they had included a clause specifically regarding undisclosed liabilities, a legal euphemism they were using to describe me and the original loans I still technically held. They were terrified that if I showed up, I would remind the world that Jared was not born into money, that he was not one of them. They wanted to ensure that I had no legal claim on the company I helped finance. They were stripping him of his assets before the vows were even exchanged. And Jared, desperate for their approval, was holding the pen. That was the moment the grief evaporated. In its place, something cold and sharp crystallized in my chest. This was not just a wedding. It was a hostile takeover. They were not just rejecting me because I was poor. They were rejecting me because I was the only witness to the truth. They wanted to bury the history of how Jared Hale came to be so they could rewrite him as a puppet for the Rowell Empire. I stood up, my knees cracking slightly in the silence. I walked to the closet and pushed aside the everyday cotton shirts. I reached for the very back, pulling out a garment bag I had preserved for a future that had never arrived. Inside was a suit of midnight blue silk, tailored and severe. It was not the dress of a festive guest. It was the attire of a matriarch. I laid it out on the bed, smoothing the fabric with hands that had scrubbed floors and signed loan papers. I went to the mirror and looked at the woman staring back. I saw the lines around my eyes, the grey in my hair. They saw these things as signs of decay. I decided to wear them as medals of war. I was not going to Ridgeford Bay to beg for scraps of affection. I was not going to cry in the corner and hope my son would notice me. I was going there to reclaim the narrative. A dark, unfamiliar thrill curled in my stomach. For the first time in my life, I did not want to protect Jared from the consequences of his actions. I wanted him to feel the weight of them. I wanted Sienna and her arrogant parents to look me in the eye and realize they had underestimated the woman they called invisible. I fastened my pearl earrings, the only valuable jewelry I owned, and stared at my reflection. I am coming to take back what is mine, and I am going to burn their house of cards to the ground. I needed a final piece for my outfit, a simple silk scarf to cover the scar on my neck from a surgery I had 10 years ago. I walked into a high-end department store downtown, a place where the air smells like expensive perfume and judgment. I was browsing the clearance rack in the back when I heard a voice that made my stomach turn. It was Beatrice Rowell, Sienna's mother, accompanied by a woman I recognized as their family lawyer. They were standing on the other side of a display of crystal vases, unaware that the woman they were trying to erase was standing 5 feet away. I froze, my hand clutching a grey scarf. I did not intend to eavesdrop, but when I heard my son's name, I could not move. Beatrice was laughing, a sharp, brittle sound. She said that Jared was lucky Sienna was willing to take on a project. That word struck me. A project. The lawyer lowered her voice. But in the quiet of the store, it carried clearly. She mentioned that Jared was not as liquid as he appeared. She said he was sitting on $300,000 of bad debt from a failed tech venture he had tried to hide from the public. My heart hammered against my ribs. Jared had told everyone he was flying high, but he was drowning. Then came the truth that shattered everything. Beatrice said that once the marriage license was signed, the Rowell Family Trust would absorb the debt. But in exchange, Sienna would gain controlling interest in Jared's company. They were not marrying him for love. They were acquiring him. They were buying a distressed asset under the guise of a romance. Beatrice said that the only thing that could ruin the branding of the self-made genius was the truth about his background. She said that if people knew he was still dependent on loans from a poor mother, no less, the stock value would plummet before the merger. Then Beatrice said the words that will ring in my ears until the day I die. She said, "We do not need a witness to his poverty walking around. His mother does not exist to us. Once the ring is on, she is gone for good." I felt the blood drain from my face. I gripped the scarf so tightly my knuckles turned white. They were not just embarrassed by me. I was a liability to their business deal. My very existence proved that Jared was a fraud, and they needed me obliterated to sell their lie. I turned to leave, feeling like I might be sick right there on the polished marble floor, when a young man in a store uniform stepped in my path. I recognized him instantly. It was Miguel, a boy I had tutored in English at the community center 6 years ago. He was holding a tray of champagne glasses for the VIP guests. His eyes were wide, swimming with tears, He had heard everything too. He leaned in close, his voice trembling. He whispered that he had heard them planning it. He said they were going to cut me off completely, change Jared's numbers, and move him to the coast within 6 months. He said, "Mrs. Hale, they want to bury you." I looked at Miguel and nodded slowly. I did not cry. I did not panic. A strange calm settled over me, cold and absolute. I thanked him and walked out of the store into the blinding afternoon sun. The grief I had felt for days was gone, replaced by a clarity that was almost terrifying. This was not a wedding. It was a heist. They were stealing my son, stealing his dignity, and stealing the truth. They thought they were dealing with a helpless old woman who would fade away into the background. They had no idea that they had just handed me the ammunition I needed. I realized then that simply showing up was not enough. Walking in with my head held high was not enough. I had to dismantle them. I had to wait for the perfect moment, when the lights were brightest and the lies were loudest. And then I had to pull the thread that would unravel the entire tapestry. I was not going to the wedding to watch. I was going to the wedding to testify. The estate in Ridgeford Bay was not just a venue. It was a fortress built of white stone and arrogance, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. The air smelled of salt water and imported lilies. From where I stood, hidden behind the shadow of a large oak tree near the service entrance, I could see the world my son had chosen over me. It was a spectacle of excess. There were white tents that rippled in the breeze like sails, and the lawn was dotted with guests who looked as if they had been cut from the pages of a fashion magazine. I watched the arrival of the guests through a gap in the hedge. Luxury cars rolled up the driveway one after another. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in gowns that cost more than my car stepped out, their laughter tinkling like broken glass. Cameras flashed incessantly, capturing every manufactured moment for the social columns. The buzz was palpable. Everyone was whispering about the perfect couple, the perfect day, the perfect merger of two beautiful bloodlines. It was nauseating. I saw Sienna's parents, Beatrice and Richard Rowell, holding court near the entrance. They looked like royalty greeting their subjects. Beatrice was wearing a silver gown that shimmered in the sunlight, her voice carrying over the music of the string quartet. I drifted closer, careful to stay out of direct sight, and I heard her dismissive tone as she spoke to a senator's wife. She waved her hand airily when asked about the groom's family. She said that Jared's people were unable to travel, implying that we were too unsophisticated or perhaps too infirm to handle such a grand affair. She painted a picture of a quaint, distant background that was best left unseen. Then the music changed. The heavy wooden doors of the main house opened, and the ceremony began. I moved to the edge of the seating area, just behind the last row of white chairs. Jared stood at the altar. He looked handsome in his black tuxedo, the very image of the modern success story. But I know my son. I know the nervous tick in his left hand when he is afraid. I saw him adjust his cufflinks 3 times in 10 seconds. He was smiling, but his eyes were darting around the crowd, anxious and hollow. He was looking for validation. He was looking for safety. He did not know that the only person who had ever truly offered him those things was standing 20 feet away, preparing to shatter his world. Then Sienna appeared. She paused at the top of the aisle, bathed in the golden hour light. She looked like a goddess, a vision in white lace and silk. The crowd gasped in unison. It was a masterclass in performance. She walked with a slow, measured grace, Her eyes locked on Jared with a look of adoration that I now knew was as calculated as a bank transaction. She was not walking toward her husband. She was walking toward her acquisition. The officiant began to speak. The guests settled into a reverent silence. This was the moment. The wind coming off the ocean was cold, but I felt a burning heat in my veins. I stepped out from the shadows. I did not sneak in. I did not hunch my shoulders or look down. I walked onto the grass with the rhythm of a woman who owns the ground beneath her feet. My midnight blue suit caught the light, a stark contrast to the sea of pastels and black ties. I walked past the security guard who was too stunned by my authoritative demeanor to stop me. I moved to the center of the aisle, just a few yards behind the last seated guest. At first, no one noticed. They were all entranced by the lie unfolding at the altar. But then, the sound of my heels on the stone paver echoed during a pause in the music. A woman in the back row turned her head. Her eyes widened. She nudged her husband. He turned. The whisper started low, like the rustle of dry leaves, and then it spread. Heads began to turn, one by one, creating a ripple of confusion that moved toward the front of the church. I stopped. I stood tall, my hands clasped loosely in front of me, my chin raised. I looked directly at the back of Jared's head. The murmurs grew loud enough that the officiant faltered in his speech. Sienna's mother, sitting in the front row, turned around with a look of annoyance that quickly dissolved into pure shock. The air in the garden shifted. The joy evaporated, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. I was the anomaly. I was the ghost they thought they had exorcised. I saw the colour drain from the faces of the few people who knew who I was. I did not say a word. I did not have to. My presence was a scream. I locked my eyes on the altar, waiting for my son to turn around. Now it is my turn. Sienna was the first to break. Her perfect porcelain mask cracked, and the colour drained from her face so fast I thought she might faint right there on the altar. She gripped her bouquet of imported lilies until the stems snapped in her hands. That was the signal. Jared turned to follow her gaze, and when he saw me standing there in the aisle, his knees buckled. The confidence of the self-made CEO evaporated in a split second, replaced by the terrified look of a boy who has been caught in a lie he cannot talk his way out of. He did not wait for the officiant to stop speaking. He scrambled down the white wooden steps of the gazebo, abandoning his bride, and rushed toward me. He hissed under his breath, his eyes wide and pleading. He told me I had to leave immediately. He grabbed my elbow, his grip tight and bruising, trying to steer me away like a bouncer removing an unwanted drunk from a club. He whispered that I was making a scene and that we could talk about this later. I pulled my arm back with a sharp jerk that startled him. I did not lower my voice. I spoke clearly, projecting my words to the back row so that every senator, every investor, and every socialite could hear me. I told him, "You invited everyone in this zip code to celebrate your life. You invited strangers. You invited the press. But you excluded the mother who gave you that life." The silence that followed was heavy, but then came the sound of movement. I saw phones rising in the air. The guests were not looking away in embarrassment. They were recording. The live streams were starting. This was no longer a private ceremony. It was a spectacle. Beatrice Rowell marched down the aisle, her face twisted in a snarl that ruined her carefully injected youthfulness. She did not look at me with humanity. She looked at me like I was a stain on her carpet. She screamed at the security guards hovering at the perimeter. She shouted for them to remove this trash from her property. She called me a senile, jealous woman who was ruining her daughter's perfect day. That was the moment I reached into my bag. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out a thick manila folder. I held it high in the air so the afternoon sunlight hit the official legal seals. I looked Beatrice dead in the eye and asked her a simple question. I asked her, if I am such a burden, if I am so poor and embarrassing that I cannot be seen here, then who paid for the startup capital that put your son-in-law on the map? I opened the folder. I read the date and the amount aloud. I announced that on October 4th, 2014. I signed a secure loan for $50,000. I revealed that while Jared was telling the world he was a visionary, building a company in a garage with his own savings, I was the one paying the interest on the equipment he was using. I told them that the suit he wore to his first investor meeting was paid for with my overtime shifts. Jared turned white. He looked at Sienna, and I saw the absolute horror in his eyes. It was not just shame. It was fear. He had lied to her too. He had let the Rowells believe he was solvent, that he was fully independent. He had never told Sienna that his empire was built on his mother's credit score. He sank to his knees on the grass, his head in his hands. He looked small. He looked defeated. But I was not finished. I turned my gaze to Sienna, who was standing frozen on the steps. I pulled a second document from the folder. It was a copy of the draft agreement Arthur had told me about. I asked Jared if he knew why they were rushing this wedding. I told him it was not because they loved him. I told him to look at page 42 of the prenuptial agreement they were forcing him to sign later that evening. I revealed that the contract stated the Rowell Family Trust would assume controlling interest in his company in exchange for covering his undisclosed debts. The crowd gasped. The veneer of the high society fairy tale dissolved instantly. Guests were standing up, craning their necks to see the papers. Beatrice was screeching at the guards, but they were too confused by the revelation to move. Sienna stood alone at the altar, looking not at her fiancé with love, but with the cold calculation of a predator whose trap had been sprung too early. The wedding had turned into a chaotic interrogation, and I stood in the center of it, holding the paper trail of their deceit in my hands. Jared snatched the papers from my hand. He read the lines I had highlighted in neon yellow. I saw his lips move as he read the words, total acquisition and transfer of voting rights. He looked up at Sienna, his eyes filled with a betrayal so deep it looked like physical pain. "You told me this was standard," he stammered, his voice barely audible over the rising murmurs of the crowd. "You said this was just to keep our assets separate. You said it was for my protection." Sienna did not deny it. She could not. The proof was right there in black and white, stamped with her father's legal seal. Instead, she lashed out. "Oh, grow up, Jared," she shouted, her voice cracking with desperation, losing all of its rehearsed softness. "You needed saving. You are drowning in debt from that failed app, and Daddy was going to bail you out. Did you really think we would do that for free? Did you think we were running a charity?" The crowd erupted. The facade of the fairy tale romance was not just cracked, it was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. I heard a man in the second row say loudly, "It is a hostile takeover, not a marriage." The reporters who had been relegated to the back were now pushing forward, ignoring the velvet ropes, their cameras raised high to capture the groom's humiliation. Security guards were yelling into their earpieces, trying to figure out who to remove the groom's mother, Who was standing calmly with the truth in her hands, or the guests who were documenting the meltdown? Richard Rowell, Sienna's father, lunged toward Jared, trying to grab the contract. But Jared pulled back, clutching the paper to his chest. For the first time in years, my son looked at these people, the people he had desperately tried to impress, the people he had cast me aside for, and saw them for what they really were. The luxury, the flowers, the ocean view. It was all just wrapping paper on a cage. The chaos was absolute. People were standing, shouting, pointing fingers. The officiant had already retreated to the side, closing his Bible, wanting no part of the legal and social disaster unfolding before him. I stood amidst the shouting and the confusion, the eye of the hurricane. I had exposed the financial lie, and the wedding had dissolved from a solemn ceremony into a public brawl. I watched Sienna trying to spin the story to her bridesmaids, her face flushed with panic. I watched Beatrice screaming at her husband to do something, to fix it. They thought this was the worst of it. They thought the embarrassment of an exposed prenup was the climax. They were wrong. I looked at the high-tech sound system set up near the altar. The chaos was the perfect cover for my final move. I had torn down the business deal. Now it was time to tear down the woman. The argument over the legal contract was loud, but what I did next brought a hush over the entire estate that felt like the air had been sucked out of the world. I walked up the 3 steps to the altar, ignoring the officiant who backed away in fear. I took my phone out of my pocket. I had recorded the conversation in the store, and now I held the device up to the microphone that was still live, broadcasting to the hundreds of guests and the waiting cameras. I pressed play. At first, there was just the rustling sound of fabric and the background noise of the department store. Then, Beatrice's voice rang out, sharp and unmistakable, echoing across the perfectly manicured lawn. She was laughing about acquiring Jared like a piece of property. But then came the voice that made every person in the audience freeze. It was Sienna. Her tone was not the sweet, melodic soprano she used for the cameras. It was cold, flat, and filled with disdain. His mother is a poverty-stricken embarrassment. The recording played, the words booming over the speakers. We just need to cut her off completely. She is an outdated relic. Once the ring is on, she is gone. We will change the numbers, and she will never hear from him again. I stopped the recording. The silence that followed was absolute. It was heavy and suffocating. I looked at the crowd. Hands were covering mouths. Eyes were wide with shock. They had come to see a union of love, but they had just heard a conspiracy to isolate a son from his mother. Beatrice Rowell was the first to recover, though her voice was shaking. She stepped forward, waving her hands frantically at the guests. She claimed it was fake. She shouted that technology could fake anything these days, and that I had doctored the audio to slander her daughter. She looked desperate, her eyes darting around for anyone who would believe her. But nobody moved. The malice in that recording was too specific, too candid to be manufactured. Jared turned slowly to face Sienna. He looked like a man who had just woken up from a coma to find the world on fire. He stared at the woman he was minutes away from marrying. He asked her if she said it. He pleaded with his eyes for her to deny it, but the guilt was written in the crimson flush rising on her neck. I stepped closer to my son, but I spoke to the crowd. My voice was steady, fueled by a lifetime of endurance. I told them that I had remained silent my entire life so that my son could have a better one. I said that I had stayed in the shadows, wearing old clothes and eating cheap food, so that he could shine in the light. I looked directly at Sienna and said that they had made a mistake. They took my silence for weakness. They took my sacrifice and tried to sharpen it into a weapon to stab me in the back. Sienna snapped. The humiliation was too much for her. She began to scream, a shrill, ugly sound that tore through the elegance of the venue. She pointed a trembling finger at me and shrieked at the security team. She demanded that they drag me out. She yelled that I was ruining her life and that I had no right to be there. 2 security guards hesitated, looking between the screaming bride and the dignified older woman standing at the altar. But before they could take a step, a young man in a server's uniform stepped out from the catering tent. It was Miguel. He walked right onto the grass, ignoring his manager's hiss to get back to work. He raised his voice so everyone could hear. He said that he was there at the store. He pointed at Sienna and her mother and said he heard every word of it. He told the crowd that they had laughed about erasing Mrs. Hale while they were looking at crystal vases. He looked at Jared and said that they called him a project, not a husband. That was the breaking point. The guests turned. I saw the disgust ripple through the crowd. These were people who valued reputation above all else, and Sienna had just exposed herself as cruel and manipulative. The cameras that had been friendly were now predatory, zooming in on her meltdown. A woman in the front row stood up and gathered her purse, turning her back on the altar. Then another stood up. Then a whole group. The atmosphere shifted from a wedding to a public trial. The facade of the Rowell family had not just cracked. It had completely collapsed, leaving them standing amidst the wreckage of their own cruelty. I stepped closer to my son until there was nothing between us but the truth. The noise of the crowd seemed to fade into a dull roar, leaving us in a bubble of suffocating intimacy. I looked at the man I had raised, the man shivering in a tuxedo that cost more than my car, and I saw the terrified boy hiding beneath the expensive fabric. I did not offer him comfort. I did not reach out to smooth his hair. "You excluded me because you are ashamed of the past," I said, my voice low but cutting through the air like a diamond. "You look at me, and you do not see your mother. You see the poverty you think you escaped. You see the struggle you want to burn." Jared looked at me, his eyes red and swimming with tears. He opened his mouth to argue, to offer some spin, but the weight of the moment crushed him. He slumped, the posture of the CEO vanishing instantly. "I wanted to fit in," he confessed, his voice a broken whisper. "I wanted to be one of them. I did not want them to look down on me." The admission hung in the air, ugly and raw. He had sold my dignity to buy their approval. I felt a tear escape my eye, but I wiped it away with a sharp, angry motion. "You are ashamed of me," I said, letting the words land like physical blows. "You are ashamed of the woman who scrubbed floors and worked double shifts. You are ashamed of me, while you exist today, standing on this stage, solely because of the money I sacrificed my youth to earn." I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out the final envelope. It was thin, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. I pressed it against his chest, forcing him to take it. "Open it," I commanded. He fumbled with the flap, his hands shaking so violently he nearly dropped it. He pulled out the yellowed copy of the bank loan from 20 years ago. But behind it was something else. A letter. It was written on cheap lined paper. The ink faded with time. "I never gave that to you," I told him as he stared at the handwriting. I wrote it the night I signed the loan for your first business. I wrote about how I was eating one meal a day so we could make the payments. I wrote that I was terrified we would lose the house. But I also wrote that it did not matter. Because I believed you would do great things. I believed you would be a good man. Jared read the words. I watched his eyes scan the lines where I had poured out my hope and my fear. He let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp. The paper shook in his hands. He looked up at me, and for the first time in years, he truly saw me. He saw the mother who had given everything, standing in front of the people who had taken everything. You idiot! You ruined it! Sienna's voice cut through the moment like a whip. She was not looking at Jared with concern. She was glaring at him with pure, unadulterated fury. She stomped her foot on the white runner. Do you know how much this merger was worth? Do you know what you just cost my family? You let her in here, and you let her destroy the plan. Her words confirmed everything I had said. She did not care that he was crying. She cared that the transaction had failed. That was the final straw for the audience. The guests had seen enough. The murmurs turned into the scraping of chairs against the stone patio. People began to turn their backs on the altar. The camera crews were lowering their lenses, or worse, panning to film the exodus. The wedding of the century was dissolving into a farce. The investors were shaking their heads, buttoning their jackets, and checking their phones for their drivers. Jared looked around at the empty chairs, at his furious fiancée who was now berating her father, and then back at me. The reality of his isolation crashed down on him. He dropped to his knees on the grass. He reached out for the hem of my jacket, grabbing the fabric like a drowning man clutching at driftwood. Mum, he choked out, the word sounding foreign in his mouth. Mum, please. I am sorry. I am so sorry. Please forgive me. I looked down at him. Every instinct in my body wanted to pull him up. Every part of my heart wanted to hold him and tell him it would be all right. But I stood still. I pulled the fabric of my jacket gently but firmly from his grip. You are sorry because you got caught. Jared, I said, my voice cold and final. You are sorry because the cameras are rolling and your investors are leaving. You are sorry because you lost everything. I took a step back, putting an insurmountable distance between us. But you have not yet apologized for the fact that you were willing to lose your mother. I looked at the crowd one last time. They were waiting for me to scream, to throw something, or to act like the hysterical woman Sienna had painted me to be. But I did not raise my voice. I simply adjusted the collar of my jacket and looked at the ruins of the ceremony. I did not come here to ruin a wedding, I said, my voice carrying over the wind coming off the ocean. I came here to bury the lies. I turned my back on them. I walked down the aisle, the same path Sienna had taken only 20 minutes before. The silence was broken only by the sound of my heels clicking against the stone. As I passed the rows of white chairs, I saw the guests looking at me. Their expressions had changed. There was no pity in their eyes anymore. There was fear, yes, but there was also respect. I heard a woman whisper to her husband that I was the only honest person there. I heard footsteps pounding on the grass behind me. It was Jared. He was calling out to me, his voice cracking with panic. He shouted for me to wait. He shouted that we could fix this. But I did not stop. I did not slow down. I knew that if I turned around, if I looked at his tear-stained face, the mother in me would want to save him. And he did not need saving. He needed to fall. I walked through the iron gates of the estate, and climbed into the taxi I had waiting for me. As the car pulled away, I refused to look in the rearview mirror. The fallout was swift and brutal. By the time I got back to my small house, the story was already leaking out. The guests, angry at the deception and the ruined afternoon, had talked. The video of my confrontation, and specifically the audio of Sienna's cruelty, circulated online within 2 hours. The Rowell family tried to spin it. They issued statements claiming the recording was taken out of context. But nobody listened. The high society of Ridgeford Bay is a small circle, and they do not forgive public embarrassment. Sienna was socially quarantined. Her charity galas were cancelled. Her friends stopped returning her calls. Jared fared no better. The investors who were at the wedding pulled their funding the very next morning. The board of directors for his company called an emergency meeting and voted to remove him as CEO, citing a breach of ethics and the undisclosed financial liabilities I had revealed. The narrative of the self-made man was dead, and with it, his career. He lost the apartment. He lost the car. He lost the prestige he had sold his soul to keep. I sat in my living room 2 weeks later. The house was quiet, but it was not the lonely silence that had haunted me before. It was a peaceful silence. I made myself a cup of tea and looked around at the furniture I had bought with my hard-earned money. It was not luxury, but it was mine. I had my dignity. I had my name back. Jared has come to the door 3 times in the last week. I see him through the front window. He looks thinner. He wears jeans and a t-shirt, not the suits he used to prize so highly. He knocks and waits. He leaves letters in the mailbox apologizing for his weakness. I read them, but I do not open the door. Not yet. I am not punishing him, but I am teaching him. He needs to understand that access to my life is a privilege, not a right. He needs to rebuild himself from the ground up, without my help and without Sienna's money, before he can stand in front of me as a man. I opened my journal last night and wrote a final entry for this chapter of my life. I wrote that a mother's love never truly dies, but respect is something that must be constructed brick by brick. If he wants to be my son again, he has to do the work. I stood before the window this morning as the sun came up. I am 54 years old. I have no fortune. I have no empire. But as I watched the light hit the trees in my yard, I smiled. It was a small, genuine smile. I did not win by screaming or fighting dirty. I won by standing in the truth. I forced the people who looked down on me to collapse on the very stage they had built to exclude me. I turned away from the window and walked into my kitchen to start the day. I am strong. I am calm. And for the first time in a long time, I am completely free. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I am really curious to know where you are tuning in from and what you would have done if you were in my position. So please drop a comment down below to share your thoughts and let's get a conversation going. If this story resonated with you, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and go ahead and smash that hype button to help this story reach even more people. Your support means the world to me.